G'day and welcome back to Critical AFL on YouTube for part one of this four-part off-season series of players to watch in 2026. I'm Damien, and today I'll be discussing our new draftees, specifically in order of who is most likely to have the biggest impact in the coming season, where I do expect to see West Coast make a big statement by getting up off the canvas and separating ourselves from the bottom of the ladder. All four parts of this series will be centered around immediate impact in 2026, which will include coverage of obviously today's one, which is draftees. And then, secondly, emerging talent that's already on our list that I expect to have a breakout impact next year. Thirdly, senior inclusions to the club that will help us with immediate improvement. So that's guys from the trade period and the SSP. And then finally, a senior resurgence from established players that West Coast have had through injury or either returning from form are expected to also improve their performance and the side next year. And then finally, I do intend to give a verdict, probably centering out on how all of them come together and which of those four categories is likely to have the largest impact on the side next year. And today we're going to start off with the first episode on draftees, like I mentioned. But before we get going, I'm going to make my own personal appeal to anybody watching these videos who isn't a subscriber to please consider hitting the subscribe button and helping make this channel and all of the content produced on it more sustainable long term. I've noticed a great deal of growth from an entirely new audience since the AFL season finished. So I'm happy to let all of you know that throughout the season, I do provide reviews of not just the AFL games, but also our waffle side, including, I think, reasonably reliable information just by track record on who's going well and who's close to pushing their way into the AFL squad. The trade, draft, and off-season content that you're now watching right now is designed to keep the content rolling all year round. So if you do hit that button, you can be sure to never go too long without getting your West Coast fix. And speaking of fix, let's take a look at our new draftees. So kicking us off as our number one draftee to impact in 2026 is the number one selection from the 2025 AFL draft, Willem Dersma. Dersma sits at the top of this pile not because of this title, but because of how quickly I expect all of his attributes to translate into not just an appearance in round one, but an immediate impact in the midfield role that he's been attached to since joining the West Coast Eagles. So for everybody who has been following along with my draft coverage, you probably already know that I've been making some pretty bold comparisons to Marcus Bontempelli. I don't expect the impact to be anything like that, but that is the way that he plays when I see him in the midfield. And I do expect to see him slot in really nicely alongside that established midfield that we're going to have next year in your Harley Reid and Elliot Yeo in particular. Those guys are probably our starting primary mids. But then you've also got like Elijah Hewitt, Tim Kelly, and if you look at that mix, Devon Robinson as well, you're going to look at, I think, Willem Dersma being a really nice fit just based on his role and the role of the guys around him. His high marking, long reach, and that silky disposal makes him the perfect guy to slot in alongside your ball winners like Robertson and Hewitt, maybe to receive off them, but also creating space to spread that ball out to line breakers if he doesn't dispose of himself to guys like Harley Reid and Elliot Yeo. So I think that the style of midfielder that we've picked up in Willem Dersma, now that we've announced that that's where we're going to be starting him, that's where we're going to be pushing him, even though he can move around the field, makes him, I think, a really likely guy to make an immediate impact next year, probably as early as round one. At number 2 on my list, I've got Josh Lindsay, who we picked up at pick 19 in the national draft, but who already has elite AFL weapons in the form of his disposal by foot, especially off halfback, which is the position he's been drafted from. I think the term super boot is probably more reserved for your Shannon Hearn, Miles Bergman types, who really punt that ball around that 65 metres just as their regulation kicking, while Josh Lindsay's disposal by foot is more just what I would describe as elite. Most of his highlights footage shows him taking possession, looking up the ground, hitting targets, often through congestion, with pinpoint accuracy, and all of that in less than a second under pressure regularly. And the value of a guy with this level of awareness, skill, and ability to execute cannot be understated in the modern game. The way that games are won and lost on the ability to transition the ball out of defensive 50 is becoming more and more important every year that's gone by in the last 3 years at least, and it will continue to. While at the other side, so the teams opposing you, Josh Lindsay types, their desire to play forward half footy, it's a term you hear a lot, just by keeping the ball in there after winning it forwards, makes him a potential match winner with the abilities that he's got to just hit targets, just break through zones really, because those zones tend to make it very hard to pick guys off. I think I've spoken at length throughout the season about some of the guys that get a really bad rap coming out of the back line because they try and hit those targets. And even if you're off by a little bit, you get embarrassed, you get turnovers, and you get goals out of them. So he's going to sit on hopefully on the other side of that line where when he does pick hard targets, he hits them. I've also seen a decent turn of pace from him as well in the footage provided. So my attitude is that if West Coast's strength and conditioning team are able to just get his GPS numbers up to the AFL standard over the preseason, then he'll find a spot in our first 23 at some point, I think reasonably early in the year, and is likely to keep it. At number 3 on my list, I've got Sam Allen, who I swapped with Cooper Duff Tyler. Spoiler alert, that's who I've got at number 4, just at the last minute. And I think purely because at the third on this list and onwards, we are looking at guys who are probably most likely to make their appearance or have an impact a little bit later in the season at best, which is probably the earliest you can expect from Sam Allen anyway, given he's currently on his recovery from an ACL that happened early this year. I do know that in his press conference when he came to West Coast, the conversation was that he'd be likely to be match ready around May, which would obviously then lead to waffle games before he goes and takes a step into the AFL. But that's not that late in the season. And I will say, however, that once Allen does recover, complete his conditioning and then reach full fitness, that he's going to be working his way into a role on the wing where we'll have a need and therefore room for a guy of his athleticism and skill to step in and make an impact. So it's probably not the most competitive part of the ground when you're looking at guys who it's a specialist role. Does this mean that he'll definitely do that? No, it doesn't. But I do believe that after a handful of games at waffle level, given what we know about his quality, I mean, he went at 29 in the draft with an ACL. So I think he's definitely someone who's probably expected to be rated a little bit more highly than where he went. That he's likely to perform and post the GPS numbers required to crack the AFL side based on what his strengths were before he did that injury. And most likely have a breakout game or two that shows us all that we have a modern wingman in our side now. Anyway, like I just gave away a minute ago, I do have Cooper Duff Tyler, CDT, at number 4 on this list. To be absolutely clear, I've raved all draft period about him coming to West Coast, and his position on this list is purely a reflection of what I'm expecting from him in 2026, in the 2026 AFL season specifically, not his ceiling, which is high. As we all know, even top-end rucks don't walk into the competition as early as players in other positions. In fact, I'd really like to know from anyone watching this how long it took someone like Matthew Cruiser, who I think is one of the quicker guys to get into the AFL 22. I didn't bother researching that before I made this video, but if anyone knows off the top of their head, put it in the comments. Anyway, all that said, I have a really sneaky dark horse suspicion that Cooper Duff Tyler may just turn up and start making a difference for us as early as the tail end of the 2026 season. Reasons for one, having watched his national championship footage all year, there's no denying that his ground level ability is there. For a guy his size, he attacks the ball movement with the ball in his hands as aggressively as anyone. And just on that alone, there's a head start on every other ruck that I've seen come through who really rely on their ruck craft, their height, and just what they can do in the air. In his ability to add another pair of hands, really threatening to win the first contested ball in the centre of ground is where I'm going with this. So he can create those clearances not just from what he does when the ball goes up in the air, but when it hits the ground as well, which kind of creates an extra man. Secondly, his 2 kilometre time trial was also in the upper tier of draftees who are fit enough to play 4 quarters of AFL on the field with all the senior players. Just every year there are players who take no time adjusting to the shift in the ground that's required to be covered over a full game of AFL footy. And I think the 2 kilometre time trial is one of the best indicators of which those guys are. Then thirdly, the one thing that would delay his debut has actually been diluted a little bit by the new rules next year, which is the ruck craft element and essentially the wrestling that goes into it especially. So essentially, as fit and as skillful as he might be, being a ruckman has always been the toughest role to move into early because so much of it comes down to, for lack of a better term, that man strength that needs to be built up over extra years from being 18, especially when you consider how much vertical growth is required for a kid to hit 201 centimeters at 18 years of age. They don't tend to come in and look like Matt Rao did when he starts. However, one rule change at centre bounce is that players cannot cross that centre line and seek body contact before tapping the ball, which takes this back to the run and jump event, which I think favours someone who's not fully filled out yet. The other rule change is free kicks for out of bounds across the middle of the field, so outside those 50s, which again is another move that just reduces the amount of one-on-one wrestling that ruckmen do over 4 quarters. So you could predict that his tank, because it's exhausting wrestling someone who's 20 kilos heavier than you, he'll get more out of that tank in his first year than you previously would have as a ruckman. At the end of the day, those two changes not only favour the ruck profile that Cooper Duff-Tytler brings to the AFL, but it also favours the timeline to him surviving 4 quarters in the senior competition. So for those reasons, despite being at number 4 on this list, I am really excited to see Cooper Duff-Tytler in action next year, starting at waffle level, which I'll keep you all updated by covering weekly in my reviews next year, and then hopefully in the AFL side at some point before the season finishes. My number 5 on this list is Fred Rodriguez, the WA captain of the National Championships, and one of our biggest steals over the draft period. Picking him up in the rookie draft after he was overlooked in the official national draft. I think getting Josh Lindsay at pick 19 was also a pretty good steal, but then when you factor in that Rodriguez came to us essentially as a free hit, because that's really what the rookie draft is at that stage, he takes my award for that title. Fred Rodriguez is a tireless, hardworking inside mid who we probably could have done with drafting a couple of years ago when we were really in desperate need for players in that mould. The reason he's right towards the back end of this list is because of the senior competition that he now has for this role, that we brought in the form of, Devon Robertson. You could also with Harry Schoenberg, Finn McRae. I honestly couldn't tell you if he's going to muscle his way past those guys in his first year, which is why, like I said, he's at number 5 on this list. And especially when you look at the likes of, say, Tom Gross and Clay Hall, who already have additional pre-seasons, 1 and 2 respectively, ahead of Rodriguez under their belts. But I do believe that we're going to see him banging down the door repeatedly in the waffle. And I also wouldn't be surprised if he seizes an opportunity to hold his spot if he's given one. Again, like others from 3 onwards on this list, that would likely be in the final third of the season, but it still counts towards having an impact in 2026 if he does. My number 6 and final player on this list of draftees to watch out for in 2026 is Tyler Williams. Like I've covered in my draft videos, he's got speed and agility that I think compares him to Darcy Jones at GWS, but probably perhaps without the GPS numbers and ability to hunt the ball the way that Darcy Jones did, that made him a walk-in starter at GWS when he's not injured, of course, because he lost a lot of his lead to ACLs. He said his second one. I think also, like I mentioned in my draft videos, what we can expect from Tyler Williams is probably a year of waffle highlights finding their way onto the West Coast media pages. But also we do have competition for spots in our small forward department starting to open up, just with Liam Ryan departing to St Kilda, Jamie Cripps in what is likely to be his final year, and then some of our other small forwards competing on a pretty even playing field for those remaining spots. Does give him a chance to make the AFL 23 next year. My prediction is for Tyler Williams that if he does crack the AFL side, he may be one of the youngsters likely to get that opportunity, show his ability, and then possibly dip in and out of the waffle while we all get a chance to see what his long-term potential and his ceiling is going to be as he gets more time in the system. Anyway, that wraps up part 1 of my series on players to watch in 2026, which was the draftee chapter. You might notice that I covered literally every player that we have in the draft in this video, which I thought was fitting just to give everyone a little look forward at every one of our new players rather than, let's say, exclude 1 or 2 guys from the video unnecessarily, especially since I wouldn't bank on any of them not getting a debut next year. And it won't be long before the next installment's out, which is senior inclusions. That will cover senior players traded in from other clubs or picked up during the supplemental selection period, like I mentioned. And don't underestimate the guys that we got from that final mechanism. And I expect those guys to also have an immediate impact in our best 23 next year. So if you subscribe to the channel, then I look forward to seeing you all again for that video, and cheers until then.